Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union. In this one, the Russians have made several advances, mainly centered around Pokrovsk, where we now enter the second day of the Russian offensive to start storming the city. The Russians have managed to gain a foothold in the southern parts of the city, gaining control over parts of the southern outskirts of the urban areas. The Russians pushed through to gain control over Leontovichi, which opened the road for the Russians to gain control over the waste heap here to the southwest of Pokrovsk. Gaining control over the high ground allowed them to push into the residential area here in the southern outskirts of the city, reaching the apartment complex area overlooking the fields and fortifications to the south of the city. Combined with an assault through the railway area to gain control over Junoshvina, as well as the majority of Novopavlivka, completely encircled the Ukrainian forces in between the southern district and the railway area, allowing the Russians to gain control over several fortified positions with a combined assault through the center of it and connecting the forces along the railway with the ones along the residential area. As for the Russian soldiers within the city, there's come a lot of different reports. The map initially said that they completely got rid of anyone that entered the city. A Russian source that is very reliable started out saying that no one was in the city, then said someone is in the city, but they're keeping it secret, and then back and forth between those two, being very vague about it. Therefore, I'll just leave it as a gray zone, but we can assume that at this point, the Russian soldiers are no longer there. They were either defeated or retreated. Instead, it allowed the Russians to advance to the south of the city, establishing themselves within the southern residential area of the city, and now fighting is taking place over this very large apartment complex area in the southern parts of the city. This apartment complex area is the decisive part of the city, the Shakhtarsky district of the city. Gaining control over the Shakhtarsky district overlooks the entire defensive lines of the Ukrainians to the south of the city. It allowed the Russians to advance along the railway area into the central parts of the city and advance into the city with little to no resistance. Gaining control over the city itself will not be met with much resistance either, because gaining control of the apartment complex area overlooks the entirety of the city. There is a second apartment complex area just north of the first one, and then there is the industrial area to the northeast, including an apartment complex area, and in the northwestern outskirts there's an industrial area as well. These are the major areas within the city. The remaining parts are regular residential areas. This means the southern Shakhtarsky district, the central apartment complex area, the northeastern industrial and apartment complex area, and then the northwestern industrial area. All of these add up to a face with a nose and a mouth with two eyes that is surprised, because that is really the reaction of anyone seeing these advances by the Russian forces following the months of very slow advances. What we're seeing is that the Ukrainians are very short on manpower. That means defensive positions with ATGMs and general machine gun positions, things that usually hold back regular infantry and armored vehicles from advancing, are not really that properly manned. Although the apartment complex area is well defended and well garrisoned, many of these other areas are largely empty, and the Ukrainians instead rely on drones to disable the vehicles and to hunt the soldiers. Now, what happened is one of two things. Either the 2.5-hour downtime with Starlink allowed the Russians to significantly advance across the southern flank of Pokrovsk. Within 2.5 hours, they could have gained this much control due to the lack of Ukrainian drone activity, allowing them to infiltrate the city and gain control of a vast area of fortified positions, because the Ukrainians did not have that much drone coverage, because 90% or so of their drones rely on Starlink. The other option is that the Russians simply launched a larger scale offensive, pushing through. The Ukrainians have a lot of drone operators, but at the same time, they can only activate so much. This means if the Russians quickly launch an offensive, gain control of areas, entrench themselves, then the majority would still be secure from Ukrainian strikes. That is, if they're able to concentrate enough forces in the area. In either case, the Russians have managed to gain control, advancing through the railway area, where they have to cover off the forest lines to push into Novopavlivka and strengthen themselves within the residential area there. Combined with their assault towards the Shakhtarsky district, it becomes evident what the Russian objective is. The objective is to gain control over the Shakhtarsky district, solidify their foothold within the city, and develop offensive operations through the apartment complex area to the north, the railway area in the center, and then moving on to the industrial area in the northeast. This will provide the Russians with military carrier during the fighting over the city, all the way to gain control over half of it through the eastern and southern parts. This will also allow the Russians to advance along the railway area towards the eastern outskirts of Pokrovsk, to which they can isolate Pokrovsk from Mirnorad. With recent advances by the Russians south of Mirnorad as well, the Russians could start fighting over that city as well, and then push onwards towards Pokrovsk through the railway area, cutting off the fortified positions of the Ukrainians here to the southeast of Pokrovsk, which are, for the majority part, almost fully manned. This is due to the fact that this is one of the hot sectors of the front line. The Ukrainians have the frontline positions manned, but the rear positions are the ones that are very thin, especially in these hot sectors of the front line. The majority of the fighters are located in these fortified positions to the south of the city. Gaining control over these fortified positions in between Mirnorad and Pokrovsk will allow the Russians to start fighting over both cities with no worries, as they will have the entire southern flank secure and several supply lines leading into the cities. The battle over Pokrovsk and Mirnorad is very decisive and significant for the frontline developments going forward, as it will act as a logistical hub for the main offensive operations of the Russians in the coming months. In the eastern direction, the Russians gain control over the remaining parts of Novoekonomishny in the southern outskirts of the town, gaining control over which pushed the Ukrainians out of Mikhailivka back towards the fortified positions to secure their northern flank. The Ukrainians will likely withdraw from these areas' frontline positions towards the rear and direction of Mirnorad to secure the eastern flank along the fortified positions and to secure the supply lines. Without the supply lines, they would not be able to hold their frontline positions, and we see that there are some natural barriers here to the east that allow the Ukrainians to establish a defensive line. Retreating to that one will allow them to hold a better defensive position. The Russians getting control of this eastern flank will be focused around the industrial area here east of Mirnorad, opening up the road for the battle over the city from the eastern direction. And with this, we see that it will be a combined effort by the Russian forces from the east, south, and west to storm both Mirnorad and Pokrovsk, squeeze the Ukrainian forces out of the cities as they continue attacking the rear to cut off the supplies and operationally encircle these areas while storming them directly. The Ukrainians are now being spread on a very wide front from the northern flank of Pokrovsk to the western flank of the city. The Russians in the north are targeting the logistical hubs of the Ukrainians to the north of the city, mainly the highway that connects the supplies from the north. This is supplies connected from the Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkiv regions that goes through the northern highway. And there's also the northwestern highway that connects directly to the city of Dnipro and the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Ukrainians still have secure connection through both of these highways. However, the Russians are within close proximity. A push by the Russians to gain control over Dashne, the industrial area, and then cutting off the highway with direct fire control over it to the west of the city, combined with assaults in the north towards Rodinsky and Vilitsky, will allow the Russians to physically cut the northern highway, leaving just some secondary roads to supply the Ukrainian forces getting stormed directly head-on in the Pokrovsk and Mirnorad directions. Will not be enough supplies, and the withdrawal from the cities would be under fire control by the Russian forces. Therefore, the Ukrainians would have a difficult time defending the cities, and if they withdraw from them, they'll still be taking a lot of casualties. That means the objective will likely be to hold on as long as possible while limiting supply, and instead focusing on counterattacking the flanks to regain control over the supply lines. Therefore, the main focus, the main battles taking place are directly within the cities, and on the flanks of the cities, a split between the two as the Russians storm the cities while storming the supply lines as well. In the northern flank of the city, the Russians managed to gain control over the majority of the Setishuk, as well as the fortified position to the south of the town. the Russians are slowly pushing along the defensive lines of the Ukrainians towards the railway area and onwards towards the highway area to gain control, fire control over the roads, and then physical control of them. They're slowly moving through the residential areas to provide the cover for the soldiers entrenching themselves within it. However, we see that there's this industrial area to the south of Setishuk, which is the main defensive position of the Ukrainians in the area. Gaining control over it by the Russian forces will allow them to gain fire control over the highway and railway going down towards the city. At the same time, the push through Nurivka in the north is a push towards the railway area and the industrial area here to the north, where they will be able to cut off the railway area and establish themselves for an offensive push towards Dobropilya here on the northern flank of Pokrovsk, developing of its operations further in the northern outskirts of the front line. To the east, the Russians managed to gain control over the majority of the remaining parts of Yablonivka, gaining control over the forested areas here to the south of the town and the riverline area. With this, the Russians only lack a single street to gain control over the entirety of Yablonivka and some fortified positions to secure the positions in the area, and the fighting will now be moving onwards towards the Panivka and the western flank of Kostiantynivka for them to repeat a similar offensive as the ones towards Pokrovsk and Mirnorod in the direction of Kostiantynivka, where the Russians are fighting on the northern and western flanks of the city. In the Kupiansk direction, the Russians managed to regain control over the fortified position here to the southwest of Stepova Novoselivka, as they continue offensive operations to the east of Kupiansk in a similar manner, storming the city itself while advancing along the frontline positions to keep the Ukrainian forces on the front line. Withdrawing will cause a collapse of the frontline positions. While holding their positions, they would be spread out thinly across the front line, and the Russians are storming the city itself to cut off the supplies of the frontline positions at the eastern bank of the Oskar River line. So based on this, we see that the Russians are storming Kupiansk and Pokrovsk here on the second day of the fighting within both of these cities, and they are slowly progressing while keeping the Ukrainian forces there and striking the supply lines. Again, this is the first stage of the Russian offensive operations to gain full control over the Donetsk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. Both Kupiansk and Pokrovsk is centered around the Donetsk region, but Pokrovsk also has the dual possibility of significantly affecting the Zaporizhia section of the front line to bypass the defensive lines of the Ukrainians in that direction. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.